Hello everyone, my name is Pablo Castro, and I'm going to be presenting our TMLR paper, A Kernel Perspective on Behavioral Metrics for Markov Decision Processes. And this is joint work with Tyler Kastner from University of Toronto, Prakash Panangaden from McGill University, and Mark Rowland also from Google DeepMind. So what we're looking at is Markov decision processes within the context of reinforcement learning. And so in an MDP, you typically start with a set of states, and these are unstructured states in that we have no prior knowledge of what the relationship between the various states are. And what we're often trying to do in reinforcement learning is map these states onto some function of interest, say value functions or state action value functions. And we do this via applying a function psi, say. So this is a mapping from states onto this function of interest that gives us a real value. When we're talking about representation learning, often what we want to do is we want to learn some structure in the states. So if we apply a mapping phi, we want this to restructure the state space, and then we apply the mapping psi into the same function of interest. And we're interested in learning this structure such that if we have two states, say x and y, in our original unstructured state space, when we apply the function phi to structure them, if these two states map closely together, we want them to also map closely together in this function of interest. So what we can do is we can look at the distance of these two states under the structured representation, defined with respect to some distance that we'll look into a little later, and we can compare this distance with the absolute value of the difference of the mapped values, right? So psi of phi of x is a real number, and so we can compare that with psi of phi of y. And so one way to do this is to check whether the distance of the states in the structured representation bounds the absolute value of the differences in the function of interest. And this provides a form of continuity that many people have looked into, and it has some desirable properties. So the natural question is, what's a good distance to measure the distances between states in these structured representations? One possibility is what's known as bisimulation metrics. This is something that's been around for quite a while, and I'm going to explain how to construct them, which I think gives a good idea for what they represent. So let's say we start with some initial metric d0. This could be any metric, say the everywhere zero metric, but it essentially gives you a distance between two states x and y. And we're going to apply an update operator called tk. And so tk, what it's going to do is it's going to receive a metric, in this case d0, and it's going to return a new metric. And the way it's going to do this is it's going to add first the absolute value of the difference between rewards from state x and state y under an action a, which I'll explain in a little bit. And it's going to add it with the discount factor gamma multiplied by the Kantorovich, or what's often known as the Wasserstein metric, between the next state distribution from the states x and y under the action A. And so this action A is picked in order to maximize this sum. Okay, so we feed in d0 into our update operator tk. It's going to apply this maximization over the sum, and that's going to be our new metric, which we can call d1. And d1 is a new metric between states, so we can do exactly the same thing. We can apply tk once again to d1 and get d2 and continue updating our metrics in this way ad infinitum. And in fact, we are guaranteed to reach what's known as a fixed point. So a fixed point, we're going to call it d tilde. It's called a fixed point because you can see when we apply d tilde to when we apply tk to d tilde, we're going to get exactly the same metric d tilde unchanged. So we've reached what's known as a fixed point. And this fixed point is a bisimulation metric. And what's nice about it is it provides this upper bound that we were after. In other words, the bisimulation distance between two states x and y upper bounds the absolute value of their difference in optimal values, v star. So this is pretty nice because often what we're after is this optimal value. The problem is in reinforcement learning, we don't start from the optimal value, right? We go through a set of policies along the way in order to reach ideally the optimal value. By the way, this was introduced in 2004 by Norm Ferns, Prakash Panangaden, and Doina Prikop. And the issue with this metric is it doesn't tell us anything about other policies. So in 2020, I introduced this new metric called pi bisimulation, which is very similar to the original bisimulation, except that now it's defined with respect to a fixed policy pi. So you can see there's no maximization over actions. And what's nice about this is it tells us we still have this upper bound with respect to the absolute value of the difference of values, but these values are not just the optimal value, they're whatever policy we started from pi. And of course, pi can be the optimal value, the optimal policy, pi star, but this is more general. It provides this type of guarantee even for any policy. So the issue with this is that we still have to compute this Kantorovich-Wasserstein metric between next state transitions, which is expensive and also typically requires access to the model, which is not something we have access to in reinforcement learning. And so here's the complexity of this, which is very expensive. And so what we did in a paper in NeurIPS 2021 is we defined a new operator, which is very similar to pi by simulation metrics. But instead of computing this Kantorovich-Wasserstein between the next state distribution, which you can think of it actually as an optimal coupling between these two distributions, we're computing an independent coupling. Okay, and this is what this expectation is. So we can draw these samples from the next state transitions independently for p pi of x and p pi of y. And this is going to be our update operator, t pi of m. So this is pretty nice, and we call this the Miko distance. One of the big advantages of this is that because we have this independent coupling, we no longer require computing that expensive optimization problem that is required for the Kantorovich or Wasserstein. Instead, we can do this from sampling very, very easily. The issue is that it's not what we end up with is not a regular metric. So it's kind of like a metric, but it's something we coined a diffuse metric. And what's a diffuse metric? A diffuse metric is very similar to a regular metric. It's a function that maps pairs of states into a real number with respecting the following properties. So we have symmetry, just like in a regular metric. We have the triangle inequality, just like a regular metric. But the first condition is that we have non-negative distances between any pairs of states. This means that the self distances can also be non-negative. In other words, you can have a positive distance to yourself, which seems a little counterintuitive, but this is where the term diffusion comes from. It essentially measures from an initial state how the process diffuses with respect to the stochastic transitions. So if you have a deterministic system, you will have zero distances, zero self distances. And you can look at at our original paper, the Miko paper, and the blog post I wrote, where there's some interactive widgets where you can get more familiar with diffuse metrics. Okay, so the diffuse metric is a kind of strange metric space, and when we apply it to our learning algorithms, we incorporate it as a loss with deep reinforcement learning. We don't end up, these parameters aren't living in a diffuse metric space. They're living in a Euclidean metric space. And so what's happening implicitly is that we're in a sense reducing this Miko diffuse distance into what we call the reduced Miko, and it's occurring via this operation here. So our original Miko distance is this u pi, and the reduced Miko, this capital pi of u pi, is basically subtracting the self distances so that we get zeros along the diagonal. In other words, we get zero self distances. So this seems pretty natural. It's kind of nice that we get a metric. However, it doesn't come without a price, and the price is that we lose this upper bound. So we no longer are upper bounding the absolute value of the differences in value between the states x and y under policy pi. However, when we measure this empirically with some random MDPs, so these are just MDPs that we sample randomly, we can see that this is the Miko distance. Right, so this we know, the theory tells us it's an upper bound, and we can see that in fact it is an upper bound. The pi by simulation also is an upper bound, we know that, and we see that it's quite a bit much tighter, but it's also a lot more expensive to compute. And the reduced Miko, which we have here, we can see that on average it's actually quite tight. It's above the zero, which means it's still respecting the upper bound. But in some cases it does go below and it violates this upper bound. However, on average it does seem to perform pretty well, and so this gives us some confidence that it would work well in practice. And in fact, this is what we found when we incorporate the Miko loss into many deep reinforcement learning algorithms. We can see that we see substantial improvements across pretty much every agent we try this in. And we can even plug this into soft actor critic and different types of methods. As long as there's a value component to the network that you're learning, this can be plugged in. So this is pretty nice, and this is all background. Our current work builds on this idea of Miko. And in fact, what we're trying to understand is understand a bit more the properties of this reduced Miko, which is what we're using in practice. Seems to work really well, but we lost some of the theoretical properties. And so some of the unknown properties that we investigate in this paper is whether the reduced Miko is always positive, whether this reduced Miko satisfies the triangle equality, because this was sort of left unknown in the previous paper, whether it satisfies some form of continuity, and whether the reduced Miko is even embeddable in some finite dimensional Euclidean space. Of course, it seems to be working in practice, but does the theory tell us that this should be doable? So before digging into these things, we have to go over some of the mathematical tools that we use to investigate this. And so we're going to be using the theory of reproducible kernel Hilbert spaces. And these are constructed via what's known as kernels. So kernels are a function k that they're similar to metrics in shape, in the sense that they take pairs of states and give us a real value. But the conditions to be a kernel is that it has to be symmetric and positive definite, and the definition is given here. And once we have this kernel, we can construct what's known as a reproducible kernel Hilbert space by first constructing a vector space of real valued functions using the kernel k that we have, right? So we leave the second parameter free, and that gives us a set of functions. We're going to equip this space with an inner product, which is simply given by the kernel. And then we're going to complete the vector space with respect to this inner product. And this is going to result in a reproducible kernel Hilbert space. So there's lots of literature out there. I'm not going to go through this too much. If you want more details, you can check out our paper and the references in there. But once we have this kernel and its accompanying reproducible kernel Hilbert space, we can define embeddings. We can embed states into this RKHS via this function phi. And again, recalling to the initial motivation that I gave at the start of this talk, this is essentially creating this structured state space. So this embedding function is simply sticking the state x into the first parameter of our kernel. And again, this is how we constructed the RKHS. So we leave the second parameter free, and this gives us an embedding of our states. And we can define a distance between states now that we have this RKHS. This is just looking at the distance of the two embeddings in this RKHS, and this is our distance. So this is pretty straightforward. But what's neat about it is not only can we embed states in this RKHS, we can also embed distributions of states. So we can take a distribution of states and embed it into this RKHS via this function over here. We're essentially taking an expectation, we're sampling from this distribution mu. This is a distribution over states, and looking at the embedding of each individual sample. And this can be defined via this integral. And what's nice is now that we have this embedding of distributions, we can also look at their distance in the RKHS. And it turns out that this distance is what's known as the maximum mean discrepancy. This is a notion that was introduced by Greton et al. Back in 2012, and it has some really nice theoretical properties. So this is why I mentioned it here. And it's going to be central to the proofs that we have in the paper. It won't play too much of a role in this talk, but for those that know this literature, you may be able to see some connections with some of the ideas I'll be presenting further down the road. Okay, so equipped with those ideas, we can now define an update operator similar to the update operators that I introduced before for bisimulation metrics, pi bisimulation metrics, and the Miko distance. And so this is going to take, rather than taking a distance between states, this is going to take a kernel, okay? And it's going to take a kernel and return a new kernel. And the way we're going to update this kernel is by doing this 1 minus 1/2 absolute value of the rewards. This is assuming that rewards are bounded in 0, 1, which is not a very strong assumption. Note that the sign is a little different, right? In the update operators that we had before for bisimulation and Miko, we were just looking at, in the first term, at the absolute value of the rewards. Here we're sort of, this is behind a negative term, so that the sign is a bit flipped. And you can think of these kernels as measuring similarity rather than distances, which is what we were doing with the bisimulation metrics before. And then the second term is very similar. So this has a very similar shape as what we were looking at before. We have the discount factor gamma. We have this kind of independent coupling thing happening. But instead of looking at the distance that we fed into our update operators for Miko, we're looking at the kernel. Right? So we're drawing samples from the next state distributions, and we're looking at the kernel. This is essentially looking at the distance between the next state, these two next state state distributions, right? Because we're an RKHS, we can look at distances between states as much as we can look at distances between distributions. And so what we prove in the paper is that there's a unique kernel K of pi satisfying the following equality. So this is essentially, you can think of it as a new form of a similarity between states. So this is no longer a distance between states, but a similarity between states. And we're going to define the kernel similarity metric, or KSME, as the distance between two embeddings, where the distance is with respect to the RKHS coming from this kernel K pi that we introduced here. Right? And this is the fixed point of this update operator. Okay, so again, we start with this update operator that you can feed it in any kernel. We're going to end up with this fixed point K pi. This is a kernel, not a distance. And this K pi, by what I introduced before, it gives us a reproducing kernel Hilbert space, and we can look at and gives us embeddings, and we can look at the distance of those embeddings in this RKHS, and this is what this is actually going to be a distance, no longer similarity, but it's going to be a distance. So we start with a kernel, which is similarity, and we kind of flip it on its head and end up with a metric, which we call KSME, and it's this d pi ks. Okay. So now that we've defined our kernel similarity metric, we can start looking at some of these unknown properties of the reduced Miko. So the first we're going to start is by investigating whether the reduced Miko is always positive and it satisfies the triangle inequality. In other words, do we have a reasonable metric in our hands? And so the first thing we proved is that this KSME metric is actually, you can define it in this form. So we're looking at the difference in the absolute value in differences in rewards. This is very similar to the first term in how we define by simulation metrics and Miko distance. And the second term, rather than looking at the Kantorovich or the Wasserstein, we're looking at this maximum mean, the square of the maximum mean discrepancy metric that I mentioned before. And again, this is very nice because this is a metric we can compute via samples. In fact, that was the name of that paper that introduced them. It was called the two-sample test. And so this MMD is measuring the distance between next state distributions. So this is quite a nice form, and with this proposition, we can then prove that in fact this KSME metric that we just introduced is equivalent to the reduced Miko. So because we have a valid metric in this KSME metric, and we've proved the equivalence to the reduced Miko, we're essentially equipping the reduced Miko with all the nice properties that come with KSME. So this is very nice because this was something that was a little unknown from our original Miko paper, in that we didn't know whether this reduced Miko was a reasonable object or not. And this theorem proves that in fact it is. The next thing we're going to look at is whether this reduced Miko satisfies some form of continuity. Recall that in our original Miko paper, we proved that it does violate it can violate this upper bound. It seemed like in practice, in most cases, it didn't violate the upper bound, but it can violate it in some cases. So is there some other reasonable notion of continuity that we can find? And equipped with a lot of the theory that comes with RKHSs and with MMDs, we are able to prove that it satisfies this upper bound. So it's not quite as tight as what we had with bisimulation metrics. We have this additive term here. And this term is dependent on the stochasticity of the system. So the way we've defined this term, you can think of it as this n is sort of how many steps you take into the future. So we're looking at, you can think of it as a system that's following n steps. And then when it reaches n steps, you draw two samples and then look at the variance of the rewards from those two samples. So this is essentially measuring the reward variance n steps down the road, and this is what we use to provide this additive upper bound on values. So this allows us to directly get an estimate of how loose our metric can be with respect to the values of interest that's coming from the stochasticity. And again, this has close ties to this idea of our diffuse metric, where the more stochastic a system is, the larger the self-distances may be. Okay, and then finally, we're going to investigate whether this reduced MICO is even in theory embeddable into a finite dimensional Euclidean space, which is essentially what we're doing when we use this MICO loss and the implicit reduced MICO that we produce with neural networks, because they are finite dimensional Euclidean spaces. And to prove this, we have this in this theorem that in fact we can demonstrate that in theory, Kiss-Me metric and by equivalence the reduced MICO is embeddable in a finite dimensional Euclidean space with low distortion error. So the distortion error, you can think of this epsilon. It sort of quantifies how much error we allow. And so if we have a certain error tolerance, we can compute the dimensionality of our representation in order to have this low distortion error in our representations. So this is using the Johnston-Lindenstrauss lemma, and it essentially is saying that if you have this Kiss-Me metric, or if you have this reduced MICO, you can embed it into a finite dimensional Euclidean space, provably so. Of course, the dimensions that end up coming in theory are usually much larger than what you would use in practice with neural networks. But again, these bounds tend to be worst case situations. The fact that we can prove that they are in theory embeddable is a good argument for why, or a good justification for why these metrics seem to work so well in practice. And that brings us to the next question. Does this new perspective on similarity, on state similarity and behavioral similarity for constructing representations, does it still work in practice? We saw that MICO worked very well with both value-based agents and actor-critic methods when we just plug in that loss. And what we find is that our Kiss-Me loss, which can be defined in analogous ways to the MICO loss, is very comparable to the results we get with the MICO loss. One thing that's quite nice about this is that we're no longer relying on this implicit projection or reduction of the MICO diffuse distance into this reduced MICO, which is living in a Euclidean space. With the kernel perspective, we're actually, the way we parameterize our distances is explicit. So we're taking the inner product of the distances because this is how it occurs in the RKHS. So in a sense, it's a bit more principled, both in theory and in the way we parameterize the distances. And it turns out that in practice it works very similarly. So it's worth mentioning that there was no hyperparameter optimization done for these experiments. This was really taking the same hyperparameters that was used for MICO. So it's very likely that we can get even better results if we perform some hyperparameter optimization for the Kiss-Me metric. So investigating this more empirically is something that we're looking into, and hope to share some more of that work later on. So in conclusion, what we've done in this paper is introduce the Kiss-Me metric, which is a kernel-based similarity metric that leverages a lot of the theory of RKHSs and maximum mean discrepancy. With this theory, we were able to prove the equivalence of the Kiss-Me metric with the reduced MICO that we introduced back in 2021. We proved that Kiss-Me does provide some continuity with respect to value function differences, which again, this was one of the big motivations when we started looking at behavioral metrics for representations. And we demonstrated that what we're doing with neural networks makes sense. So we can embed these theoretical constructs into a finite dimensional Euclidean space and have it be based in good theory. So one of the things that are still a bit of an open question is whether just looking at upper bounds is enough. So one thing that upper bounds tells us is that if two states are close with respect to these distances, then we are guaranteed that their values will be close, right? This is what the upper bound tells us. However, if two states are far apart with respect to the distance, whether it's by simulation or Kiss-Me or MICO, it doesn't necessarily tell us that the values of the two states are also far apart. They could be very close. So perhaps we also need to look at notions of lower bounding the value functions with some other form of distance or similarity. And that's something that we're interested in looking into in the future. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy our paper, and please reach out if you have any questions or comments or would like to follow up with more suggestions. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank, before I go, the reviewers of TMLR, the anonymous reviewers, which were very helpful, and especially our action editor, Gergelino, who was really useful in providing good feedback and helping us strengthen the paper. Thanks.